Hi there, in this video we're going to unlock the door into one of the most highly valued documents that we can put together as health and safety practitioners, or anyone for that matter who's involved with safety risk assessment, and that is our Risk Assessment Index. We spent a few years compiling together all the different work examples, projects from different industries, and this really becomes our encyclopedia of risk knowledge that we can then use as our reference point when working on new assessments. And we're going to look at the top 5 hazards and controls that we typically see repeated across different industries. There are a couple in there that you might not expect, and not only that, we're going to give you real context as to why these hazard areas are so important for businesses. Also, before I forget, if you do want a copy of the document and you like the look of the document that we're discussing in this video, you can get a copy of it, and we'll drop you a link in the description over to our site at safety.com, where I'd also like to remind you that we're giving away 1 million free health and safety courses. That's right, 1 million is what we're looking to give away, so please do feel free to check those out too and make use of it. Okay, let's get into this one. Okay, this area applies over a vast range of workplace equipment, and again, in my experience, it's very often the cause of accidents, and perhaps this is why it repeatedly gets raised as a concern or a hazard in risk assessments, and that is lifting operations. Just to do a sense check on this, if we look at the stats from GB again, you might notice here that a couple of the top causation categories for fatalities are, first of all, trapped by something collapsing or overturning, and secondly, struck by a moving object. Both of these can be strongly associated with lifting operations. First of all, the overturning or collapsing of lifting equipment or vehicles such as forklifts, MUPs, mobile elevated working platforms, telehandlers, etc. is certainly something that does happen quite often, and also the failure of a lifting operation releasing materials or even the people being lifted in the case of our working platforms that we discussed. You can also see that struck by a moving object accounts for over 10% of non-fatal injuries at work as well. Again, in my experience, I've seen many examples of loads failing from lifting equipment for various reasons, with cranes and forklifts being the main protagonists here. And if you're a manager or a health and safety advisor, then it's something you should pay attention to. If you do work in an industrial or commercial environment, it's highly likely that there are at least some lifting activities that are happening. They may not be on a daily basis, but they may be part of a maintenance regime and may only happen on an ad hoc basis. So that's something to look into and find out if you're managing a site. You can see from our index that we have split the lifting operations into multiple categories again, as it encompasses a broad range of activities and equipment. So there's plenty there by means of example, and with that said, most of the general control measures can be applied across the board when it comes to lifting operations, because there are certain things that we'll always want to do if we're doing any sort of a lifting, and this includes things like administrative checks such as the 6 or 12-month statutory inspections that are typically carried out on lifting equipment. Also, we're looking at things like making sure lifts are only carried out within the safe working load of the equipment. When it comes to safe lifting, the selection of the right equipment for the job is very much of the essence. Non-standard lifts should be subject to specific assessment or lifting plan, for instance. For example, if a forklift normally lifts palletized loads of the same product on a daily basis, then that will be very repeatable and predictable. But then you might have an ad hoc requirement that comes up for lifting maybe a heavy piece of machinery. Would it make sense to just crack on with the lift as if you were just lifting a normal pallet with your regular products on it, without considering the weight, the size, the shape of the load and the weight distribution across the piece of machinery? Without taking that into consideration, would you go on ahead with it? Hopefully the answer is a resounding no, because it's likely that that lack of planning will create a huge risk of the lift actually failing on you and all of the unintended consequences that that would bring. One thing to remember here, and something that we always try to communicate to help you fail safely if a load does fail, and that's that personnel should never be underneath an unsupported load. Putting this into further context for us here, looking at a recent court case, a hydraulic tipper was being worked on to salvage parts. One of the workers was on the underside of the tipper bed when the work was being carried out. Unfortunately, the tipper bed was released from its hydraulic setting and was not propped up by the support arm on the vehicle. And when the tipper bed fell, it crushed the worker who was working below it. Tragically, due to severe internal crushing injuries, the worker died as a result of the accident. The investigation found that there had been no assessment of the risks or any safe system of work put in place to allow the work to be carried out safely. And that perhaps doesn't come as a surprise here. There was no relevant training in place then as well for carrying out that work for the personnel that were involved. And even though we were talking about actually quite a small business here in this instance, the owner was jailed for 10 months as a result of the investigation and the outcome in court, and that was for breaching the Health and Safety at Work Act in a couple of different areas. We can't always completely eliminate the risk of a load failure, and it's always worth remembering that. To reiterate the point I was saying earlier, I would always approach the planning of a lift from a place of course, trying to prevent failure, but ensuring that if a load does fail, that it fails safely. In other words, the failure can happen whilst putting no one at risk of being physically harmed. And that, of course, it goes without saying, is a much better outcome than the alternative. By the way, I'll try not to go too fast here. I know some people do struggle with my accent, so if you do have problems, there is subtitles in the bottom right hand corner, and you might get a free laugh from that because sometimes the AI system doesn't interpret what I'm saying correctly and comes out with some funny stuff, so make sure to check that out. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Slips and trips. This one may come as a bit of a surprise to you. If you're already in the industry or involved in health and safety, it may not be a surprise. It's not the first thing that most people think about when they're thinking about identifying workplace risks, because they're typically thinking about things that are a bit more significant and severe. However, when it comes to the data, it doesn't lie, and that is slips and trips are responsible for over 30% of non-fatal injuries in UK workplaces, and this is a pretty consistent and predictable phenomenon. Though they may seem innocuous or not such a big deal, it's quite astonishing just how many broken bones and serious strains and sprains that occur from simple slips and trips in the workplace. But what can we do about it, I hear you ask? Well, when it comes to trip hazards, first of all, much of the risk can be mitigated quite easily by good site design and decent housekeeping. It's also really important to make sure that employees are aware of this risk. Most workplaces are dynamic environments that require constant vigilance, and it's important to have a good proactive culture of keeping your own work area tidy and free from obvious trip hazards. That's a good place to start. When it comes to slips, particularly for fixed facilities, it's important to make sure that appropriate surfaces are in place in the right areas. What does this mean? Well, for example, if you have areas that are exposed to water on a continual basis or damp conditions even, it makes sense that non-slip surfaces should be used in those areas. It's quite easy to get caught out in this way, so something to keep an eye on is if you have people in doing work or cleaning, for example, and floors are wet at abnormal times, the use of an exclusion zone is a very easy way to manage this in the event of a leak or a spillage, for example. Another issue though to think about is to consider the footwear that people are using in these areas. In industrial environments, it may be quite easy to influence this by implementing mandatory safety shoes. There's also the seasonal aspect, so we have things like icy conditions in those areas that get cold winters, which I appreciate isn't everywhere, but in such external environments where you have extreme weather, patterns or extreme temperatures, for example. This needs to be managed properly. So obviously if you have icy surfaces, you want to have a gridding regime and an ice management system in place. One thing I would say is that if you do have an accident, a slip or a trip in a particular area, it's very likely that if you don't take any action, the same thing will happen repeatedly, and it's quite predictable from that perspective. And that's why it's important to develop that culture of taking slips and trips quite seriously, followed by identifying and removing hazards on a continual and proactive basis. And once that becomes important to your employees, your workers, and everyone involved, then you will be able to keep that accident rate down. Okay, where do we start with this one? I think it's useful to give ourselves some context on this first of all. The reason that this is such a big concern is that falls from height repeatedly appear at the top of the list for the causes of work-related fatalities or deaths. As you can see on screen, hopefully now, falls from a height made up around 30% of the fatal injuries that occurred in the most recent data set that's available for Great Britain. And this is something that repeats year after year. If you're wondering which work sector these deaths are typically related to, then it's mostly the construction industry. That maybe doesn't come as a surprise to some at the top of that list. And this is followed by the farming, forestry and fishing sector. And there's some other sectors there with considerable fatalities as well, including manufacturing, transport and also retail, accommodation and food. This is one of the reasons why falls from height are such high priority across many different sectors. And it's something that we always keep a very close eye on with clients. It's not only the fatalities, of course, that concern us here. There's also the reality that there are many serious injuries that are caused due to those falls from height and subsequently severe injuries that are associated with those accidents as well. A recent prosecution by the HSE in England saw a roofing company fined almost £1 million, £881,000, after two workers were seriously injured in two separate accidents. One worker suffered a broken pelvis due to falling through a skylight on a factory roof, and the other suffered a broken leg and a severe blood clot after also falling through a skylight on a roof on another project. So very similar accidents within the same company. They were being investigated simultaneously because they happened around the same time. And the HSE found that the company involved failed to put adequate fall prevention and protection measures in place. Of course, you might be able to guess that this is in contravention with a lot of regulations related to working at height. And needless to say, it's a hazard that should be well considered during any risk assessment. And when we talk about working at height, we're talking about work that's carried out at anything above ground level. So yes, it might seem strange to some, but anything that's any platform or any surface that's raised at all from ground level can be considered working at height. And the first expectation upon us is to try to avoid those falls from height, so to eliminate the actual risk in the first place. But if you can't avoid them, then the second thing that we need to do is try to prevent them. And if that's not possible, then we should work towards minimizing the consequences or potential impact of any fall that does happen. If that went to your head a little, let's give the avoid, prevent, minimize thing a bit more context by looking at a quick example. Let's say we're using some mobile access equipment like a scissor lift to change up some light fittings on our warehouse ceiling. First of all, we have to ask the question, can we avoid risk of falls from height? Well, unless we can eliminate the use of the equipment itself or having to get to that level without a fall risk, then it's not going to be possible to eliminate it. We can't access the light fittings in most areas via any direct means, and it doesn't make time or financial sense to create a fixed structure to access this area, as it's going to be short duration work across a wide area of the warehouse. So let's assume we've come to the conclusion that the scissor lift is our best option here. It only goes up and down, and with a small exclusion zone that's put in place, the rest of the warehouse operation should feel minimal impact from what we're doing during the work. Thinking about avoid, prevent, minimize, we'll be moving from avoiding a fall from height to preventing a fall from height when we go to use the scissor lift. So let's look at the structure of a typical scissor lift. Okay, it has a guardrail around the worker that prevents them from falling over the edge of the platform. That's great, but is it enough? There may still be some remote or small risk that the worker could fall out over the rail in certain circumstances. So we want to think a bit more about exactly how we will be working on the platform. Is there a chance that they still could overreach, for example, and go over the rail, or could the operator perhaps be tempted to stand on the rail to access the work to get the job done and thus create a risk of falling to the ground? As well as that, we want to think about things like, are there other vehicles operating below, or what sort of activity is going on? Is there a potential collision risk with our scissor lift that could also put our operator at jeopardy or in jeopardy? In most cases, there's likely to be a remaining or residual risk that the operator could potentially fall out of the basket or the platform. So we want to also consider how we can minimize any fall that might occur. We would primarily do this by using a fall arrest system consisting of a harness and a short restraint lanyard that can be fixed to a suitable anchor point on the scissor lift during the work. This would both help to prevent the worker from falling from the basket, but ultimately, if they did fall out of it, coming back to that minimize portion or part that we're trying to satisfy here, their fall would be restricted with hopefully minimum physical harm done to them, and they would be in a position where hopefully we could perform a safe rescue, and that could be facilitated by the operator or other folks on the ground who can lower the lift and get the person out of trouble. Hopefully that example gives you an idea of the step-by-step thought process that we will walk through when we're implementing the avoid, prevent, minimize protocol. As you can see from our risk assessment index, there are a whole range of examples of work at height and how it can be done, control measures that apply to work at height or preventing falls from height. It covers a broad spectrum of work, and that's why we have multiple examples here, from adverse weather to rope access to even just dropping objects from height. That of course can happen unintentionally when you're working at a height. You'll be happy to know that we do have a useful guide on our website that we've created from the HSE's guidance, and that is a decision-making tool to help you go through that step-by-step process when you're considering and managing work at height. The use of hazardous substances, which falls under COSHH regulations in the UK, is something that's quite ubiquitous across almost every workplace. And the risk level can broadly range from low hazard cleaning products to highly hazardous process chemicals. We need to understand exactly what chemicals we use, how we use them, and then we need to identify those protection measures that should be in place to prevent anyone coming to harm. As you can probably imagine, the potential for both injury and illness from chemical use is quite significant. Common injuries include skin irritation, dermatitis, burns, lung disease, eye damage, and so on. And the subject itself can get pretty complex and technical. Needless to say, it's important that someone in your workplace has a good understanding of the risks that you're dealing with. I recall a story myself about a production line operator that I was told who was working with acids for descaling and cleaning metalwork. On this particular day, they had spilt some of the acid solution onto their shoes when they were moving products from one acid tank to the other. A couple of things went badly wrong, and the first one was that the person wasn't quite aware of just how corrosive the acid solution was. And secondly, to make matters even worse, they had decided to wear trainers or sports shoes into work that day rather than the safety shoes that they're issued with. When the acid spilled onto their shoes, it leached into their socks and came into contact with the person's skin. Of course, the trainers didn't do a good job of providing a barrier of any sort. Due to the operator thinking that the solution wasn't really that harmful, they didn't say or do anything until it was too late, and they ended up with severe damage to the top of their foot. So, as we can see, this is why accurate information and controls are extremely important when it comes to chemical management. Typical controls that we would normally put in place include, first of all, assessing the chemicals, and this is usually done using their safety data sheets and also process information that tells you how you use the product or how you intend to use it before you do. These are often done in the form of COSHH assessments in the UK, for example, and other key aspects include things like training your staff once you've established what the risks actually are, as we've seen in our example, having secure storage and access control to keep the chemicals out of the wrong hands, and also putting in strict waste management protocols so that things are handled correctly on the way out of your premises. And also as well, I forgot to mention just the last line of defense, of course, is PPE or personal protective equipment. And when we're dealing with chemicals, it's usually the case, and very often the case, that PPE will play a critical role in preventing that harm from happening. Again, as we said in our example there, if the person was wearing the correct PPE, the damage to the foot wouldn't have occurred. If you feel that this issue isn't well addressed in your workplace, don't forget that we do have a freely accessible COSHH awareness course over at safety.com, and I'll leave some links to that. If you need it for your employees just to get started in terms of awareness of the risks, it's really a good resource, and we've also lots of other free content here on YouTube itself for you on that very subject. Manual handling then, my favourite. This is one of our most popular free courses at safety.com, and there is good reason for it. If we take a look at the typical non-fatal accident stats for Great Britain again, you can see that handling, lifting or carrying is responsible for a massive 20% or almost 20% of injuries. Not quite as prolific as slips and trips, but it's absolutely a substantial proportion of the overall workplace related injuries. And so it's understandable that training is high on the agenda when it comes to manual handling for a lot of companies before they'll even let people work for them. But let's look a little further into what we're talking about here and the types of strategies that we would use to reduce risk in this area. Manual handling crops up on risk assessments more often than not, and as you can see on our index here, we have some basic guidelines that we would typically use to get started. Once we have that starting template, we would then make it more specific to the particular job, task or site from there. We start by mentioning training, and that includes some introductory theory that would be included in the likes of our online course, but we would also recommend always to anyone who cares to ask, you should really implement some form of in-person demonstration that is specific to your site or operation, just to check that those involved have understood the basic concepts and themes of good lifting and safe lifting, and that there's agreement on the correct way to lift the items that are specific to your environment. For more unique or complex operations, you may also want to consider doing a task-based manual handling risk assessment. And the UK HSE has some really useful resources on this subject, and although the assessment task can be quite laborious or time consuming in itself, it may well be well worth it depending on the risk profile of the work you're doing. It's worth noting as well that manual handling tasks have been broken down into different types when it comes to doing specific risk assessments on them, and these are typically, first of all, pushing and pulling, secondly, lifting and carrying, and thirdly, repetitive movements. We also have some really useful templates over at safety.com that we've created for some of these different assessments, based on the HSC's guidance. I'll leave a link to that in the description if you're interested in checking them out. When we do perform a specific assessment on a manual handling task, it really forces us to engage with the people and the process, allowing us to see exactly where the problems are and the risks where they exist. In doing so, it makes it much easier to prioritize then our time and our resources to try and reduce the most significant of those risks. And on implementing controls, we might be looking at things like purchasing mechanical equipment to assist with lifting. You can see in the risk assessment index here, we've mentioned using mechanical means for awkward or heavy loads, or just making sure that an extra person is available for heavier lifts if there's no other option than to manually lift the object. Another point I would highlight here is making sure that the importance of reporting pain or discomfort from manual handling or repetitive processes is something that's communicated well to your workforce. And something else to keep a keen eye on from my own experience is to consider how any control measure that you might use affects the speed of the production process. In other words, ask yourself, does the change that you make, for example using a lifting aid like a pallet truck, does it significantly slow down the operation? If this is the case, just be aware that people will seek the path of least resistance, and if there is an easier way to do things, particularly if that's faster, they will be tempted to do it. Okay, that's it for manual handling. It is a broad subject, of course, and to give you an extra helping hand, we'll leave some links to our free course that I mentioned earlier, and some of those templates for the more in-depth risk assessments that I discussed, and we'll leave those in the description. That brings us to the end of our top 5 risk controls from our Health and Safety Risk Assessment Index. Hopefully by digging into some of these risk areas in a bit more detail, you've taken some value away from this video, and thanks a million for watching. See you next time.